Now we're cooking with gas. Thank you. Everybody can hear me at the back okay? Perfect. Thank you. So I actually thought about a number of titles that were more interesting than the one that got the talk in. I mean, lots of people worry about freeloaders in community. Now, typically that's companies that are trying to do open source and all those people that aren't paying us money. But still, freeloaders, I'm going to try and demonstrate to everybody, freeloaders means you're doing it right. I also was thinking of what the FOSS, you know, because it's one of those things that, again, we've been doing this for, what, 25 years now? 30, the Free Software Foundation is 30 years old now. And so one of the things that I want to try and convey to people, though, is the reality is we've been doing communities since you had a campfire and I wanted to sit beside it. We understand how communities inherently work. We are a social species. One of the interesting talks yesterday, John O'Bacon said, you know, he really wants to get us to the point where nobody has to buy the art of community anymore. But the reality is, no, we're actually a bunch of technologists. We aren't a bunch of political science majors. We did not study governance systems. So we're actually in a position where we need the book. We do need some instructions and some formats and some templates for how to think about these things. But I do maintain that as a social species, we've been sharing software since we've been writing software. The reality of this is this goes all the way back, when I say Princeton there, von Neumann's original work on the original programmable computer in America, they were sharing the software they were writing as quickly with a couple of other projects that were time sharing at midnight with them. Share from IBM started in the 50s, Deakus started in the 60s, Usenix started in the 70s. We've been sharing software since we've written software. I remember going to my first Deakus and shelling out $75 for a mag tape full of software that people were sharing with me. You know, so the network we had to share in those days was tape-sized packets on a, you know, biannual conference kind of bandwidth. We did not yet have the internet and the World Wide Web, but we've shared it for a long time. And the reason for that is writing good software is hard work. And you can almost get a feel for that with GitHub right now. You know, you go to GitHub, I can't remember how many million projects have repositories there, of which it's how many thousands are actually important, of which how many hundreds are actually really golden places that you want to go participate in. Two stories, just to, again, try to set the tone of some of my experience. I was at a Usenix conference around 1999 and saw a great talk from a guy that was doing an early community around Linux video drivers. And he made the statement during his talk that there's maybe 9 developers on the planet that actually understand what you need to know to deeply work on a Linux video driver. That did not prevent them from running an open source project and encouraging contributions in. But it was a very small number of people, and most of them were core contributors already. They were committers, they had write privilege on the repositories. And he said it's orders of magnitude. For every 1,000 people you have using your software, you know, maybe if you're lucky, 100 of them may give you some feedback, of which, if it's a bug, maybe 10 of them will give you a patch, of which maybe 1 of them actually read your contribution guidelines and your coding guidelines and gave you something that was well formed. So it's orders of magnitude. That's why I try and go back to this idea that freeloaders are important. Brian Prophet, who was up on stage just before me, gave a great example of a community. We all live in towns or neighborhoods. And most of us choose to live there, and we just live there. But some people are civic-minded from time to time. You want a dog park in the neighborhood. And some people are a little more civic-minded all the time, and they actually run for city council. But a lot of us just live there. Second story. I worked for Microsoft for 5 years, 1999 to 2004. And I have the privilege of being the first guy to ever ship GPL code in a Microsoft-based product, which was kind of fascinating. We brought a product that was assembled out of open source before we called it open source into Microsoft. We were the Unix face on Microsoft, on Windows NT. This was not the Cygwin project. This was something that was actually kernel integrated. And so it was an interesting time to be at Microsoft because this was also the era of the Halloween documents. and enormous paranoia at Microsoft around this free software and open source stuff. But I got the privilege of working on a project called Rotor, and this was about 2002. We released a cut through the .NET framework. The runtime, all of it. So the base class libraries, we basically built a reference implementation for what was the ECMA standard for the shared source common language infrastructure. So they made a lot of noise last year, I think it was, about they've open sourced .NET. And Rotor, to be really clear, was not an open source license. This was for academic research. But it'll give you an idea about community building. We were really, really, really careful. It was about 500,000 lines of code, about 500,000 lines of test suite and test harness. We built a single installer that ran on FreeBSD, Mac OS X, and whatever version of Windows it was at the time. I think it might have been XP. And in doing that, we ensured that it was basically with a single command, you could set up your environment correctly. With a single command, you could build the entire software to a known state. And with a single command, you could end up running the entire test harness, and you expected to see these 3 bugs. So any developer downloading the gzipped tar archive could get to a known state in a matter of an hour of 3 commands that they had to type in. The only documentation we provided for them was to literally sit down and in a few screens, a couple of pages of documentation kind of thing, we told them the 3 commands, how to set up your environment, build it, and test it to get to a known state. And then the last thing we did was actually give them a rough idea of how the tree hung together. So we did not describe the internals of the CLI. We did not describe the internals of the base class library or anything else. We just provided the source code. 24 hours later, we got a righteous contribution. A developer who deeply understood the Intel chip architecture and deeply understood JIT technology gave us a 15-line patch that gave us a 10% boost in performance. That's fantastic. And then 24 hours later, we got a second righteous patch where they had found a bug. They fixed the bug, but not just the bug. They actually read our, they looked enough at the coding style. They fixed the bigger bug, not just the spot weld. And they even provided a test case to say, look, I fixed your bug, and here's the test case for the test suite. So that is the second righteous bug. So if you do certain things, if you take a certain attitude into, this is not about, hey, come and help. This is actually about, we want people to get to a known state quickly. You can get amazing things very quickly. Now here's the dark side of the story. We were not building a community. And this is how fast you can pour cold water on that. After we got that first righteous contribution, 10% boost in performance, we said, that's fantastic, thank you, we're not accepting contributions. Because this code base was still tied to the product. And this is 2002. Halloween documents are still coming out. Microsoft is still shriekingly paranoid about open source. Sorry, legally very conservative in their stance towards open source. And so we were not about to allow as brilliant a patch as this was into a core code base that we were still producing for product, product setup. So, and then the second bug fix came in that 24 hours later, and we said, that's great, thank you, but we're not accepting contributions. And we never saw another contribution. It was that black and white. We just had to be very public, twice, and we shot any opportunity. And we did it with malice of forethought. That was the crying shame of it. The core group of us that were part of this project, we all deeply believed in free and open source software. My background was building products out of it, so I understood that you could do this and it wasn't the most riskiest thing on the planet or any of those things. We cared. But we also understood that our marching orders were, we are not building a community and we are not taking input. And the thing was, thousands of programmers in the Microsoft .NET world still loved the project because it allowed them to actually go and do some spelunking through the code base to understand exactly how the .NET libraries worked. It was an enormous tool for learning. It had its purpose. Lots of academic work was done on it for bringing other languages to the .NET world. So again, it was useful, but it definitely wasn't open source, and we definitely weren't building community. So you can build your own tragedies. So the point is really when you start with a project, you're starting with a community that really is a conversation in code. It's not a conversation about code, and you may grow to a point where you want lots of other contributions, but at the core of it all, it's a conversation in code. And you've got a core set of committers. There might be one of you, there might be 10 of you. Probably not 10, but a few of you. And what you're really looking for is you are looking to find developers. You want at least to encourage other people to use it. Because ultimately what you want is that idea of you want an inbound contribution flow. Well, the thing is, the question you have to ask yourself is, where are you going to find those developers? Well, hanging out a sign that, if you build it, they will come, that's probably not true. But, if you actually have a set of users, well, some number of those users, when we go back to orders of magnitude, some number of those users are going to be developers. And if you can get them to a known state quickly, they may even start to do things for their absolute own selfish interest. Hey, I wanted to hack this in. Hey, I found a bug when I was trying to do that. Whatever it is. They're still not contributing anything to you, but at least you've made it easy for them to learn and get to a position where it's a known state for them. And so ultimately, you need to be growing your user base because you want to be in a position that you can find the developers and then encourage the contributions in. So this is really about, there are 3 on-ramps that you need to think about if you're trying to turn your project on your repository into a community. And that is, how are you going to find users? How are you going to make it brain dead easy to install? In that same way that with Rotor, it was trivial for a developer to get to a known state. They did not have to fuss around figuring out how to build it. How are you going to encourage developers? So if they're there, and there will be developers in your user base, how do you get them? And then how do you encourage them to actually contribute their changes back? Now, some developers are absolutely, we live in a social media world. All that's taking advantage of is a lot of us really do like contributing to the communities in which we sit. So how do you make it easy for people to contribute? So I argue there's a set of practices you have to start looking at. And these practices, so I am a software construction Nazi, I'm sorry. I believe there is one true way to build software. I don't care what tools you use, but you will have configuration management, you will automate your builds, and you will automate your test harness, which you have, and you will have a review process, because these things are important. So it is literally things like, from driving a user base, did you publish executables? Is the executable environment available? I guess is the better way to say it, because we have very broad communities now. We're doing plugins for things and the rest of it. But are the executables actually available, or are you expecting your users to figure out how to build them? Have you automated the install in any way, shape, or form? I love the fact that they made it easy on GitHub to do that kind of homepage or to build your own page, and you can sit there and a lot of people do, here, type in these 5 commands. Folks, we're computer people. It's a script. Don't tell them to type in these 5 commands. Tell them to type in this word, this simple command that's part of your source tree. And that doesn't mean that you're promising that's going to work on every architecture. Tell them what architecture it works on. Tell them to type this command or that command and have it install in a meaningful way. Have it configure in a meaningful way. So these are the kinds of things you can do to start to build from a software construction point of view, a software discipline point of view. You can make it easy to start building a user base. There's also some community building things that you need to do. Put a license on your work. Now, we're going to talk about that in a minute, and I'm going to bore you to tears, but it's important to have a license on your work. Put some kind of FAQ in place. Put some kind of mailing list or some kind of a place for people to either ask simple questions or to capture those simple first things that everybody got wrong and the script didn't quite cover. Those are the kinds of things you need to have in place. Now, I need to make sure everybody understands I am not a lawyer. Lawyers are very special. When I say this is all advice for building communities, it's advice. It's The best experience I've learned over 25 years of playing in this space. It's not legal advice. If you ever want to see a lawyer turn white, say, I think I've been given bad advice. Because they speak a different language. Those words that you and I use casually mean different things or more specific things. And so this is not legal advice. I am not a lawyer. But we're going to take a brief diversion onto licensing. So, software is protected by copyright. The people that wrote the software own the copyright. The fact that you published a GitHub repository and you don't care what people do doesn't change the fact that software has a copyright and you're the person that needs to have a say in how they use. And so you want to put a license on it, because the license is the way in the open source community or the free software community, as however you want to define us, is the way that you tell people what they can do with your software. There's a handful of licenses out there. It doesn't matter which one. I have certain preferences that I'm not going to share right now. But it doesn't matter. There's a handful of good licenses. It covers the GPL, the Apache license, FreeBSD, the BSD license, the MIT license, the Eclipse license if you're working on Java in the Eclipse community. There's a small number of licenses. The free beer license, as clever and cute and funny as it is not helpful. So use one of the common licenses. And these common licenses, these were written by serious lawyers that have been part of this broad community for 30 years now. They deeply understand the nuances as lawyers speaking legalese to one another in how to think about these concepts for other lawyers to understand. No lawyer that you hire is going to do better. It's just not going to happen. If you care about making money, if you think this is an open source project, but there may be some corporate implications to it and it may serve you well, you probably want to learn a little more about the law. There's a really good book out there for developers written by a lawyer that can help you get your head around these things. If you care about patents, and by care, I mean you either think they're a good thing or think they're a terrible thing. You care about patents. You, again, want to talk to a lawyer. It's that simple, because it's a messy space, and there's nuances out there that normal people like us don't understand. Can I ask you to hold the question? Thank you. Yes, they finally, on GitHub, the last thing I want to hammer home, on GitHub, they finally made it easy to add a license a couple of years ago. Please do that. Because right now, even 2 years after the head of GitHub stood up at OSCON and said, hey, we finally did this, there are still millions of repositories out on GitHub that have no license on them. And so it's ambiguous copyright. Or rather, we know exactly who owns it, but the user terms are ambiguous. So if you want people to be able to easily use your software, put a license on it. Okay, so how do you make it easy to encourage developers? Again, there's a number of construction things that, wrong button. Better. There's a number of construction things that you can do. This is where you start to get into, does the build automate? So when I drop the source repository, when I clone it to my machine, is it, again, trivial to turn it into an executable environment? Is it trivial to test it to a known state? These are things you just need to automate. You shouldn't be telling them to type these 5 commands, because people fat finger things, especially at 2 in the morning if you're screwing around with something and you're trying to get it to work. So automate as much as possible. Make it easy. From a community perspective, again, this is where you want to actually encourage that discussion in code. So you want to consider things like possibly a code of conduct, maybe a mission statement if you're so inclined. If you're building communities, you actually have to think about this stuff. The Art of Community as a book is a wonderful template for the things that you need to think about in this space. Another small diversion. So there are 2 ratios that define the software space. And that is the number of lines of code the average developer can write in a day, and the number of bugs per 1,000 lines. There's been lots of reasonable studies on this space. I understand how fraught lines of code is. I don't think it's a good measure any more than probably anybody else in this audience. But it is the measure that we have, and we can at least say certain things about it. We all understand, ripping out code made it better. I get it. I know. There's no discussion we can have about lines of code that we all don't eventually end up in some kind of an agreement. But those two ratios have kind of held since we've written software. And they've been measured by people that care about this stuff a number of different ways. And those ratios haven't really changed. That's the crying shame of it. So everything we've done in either programming language platforms or software engineering practices has been about delivering more software and better software in fewer lines of code. That's what we've been trying to do for 6 decades now. So it's one of those things that community and product scale. And when you talk about some of these things, the big aha for me, I don't know, 30 years ago now, was it's not about managing complex code. The reason you care about your configuration management and your automation is you can't scale without it. And what I mean by that is, back in those days, the only, 35 years ago, the only people that used configuration management and version control and make and automation and things like that, these were product companies in an early software industry. Because that's the only way you can scale your product to the point that you can support your customers. Because when you get a bug report, and you will, you need to know what that executable thing is they're running. And the only way you can do it is to be able to reliably rebuild it time and again, to know exactly what went into the recipe and what came out the other side. And the same holds true for communities. When you start looking at an expanded community around an open source project, it's the exact same problem. It's how do you reliably rebuild it? Because you're going to need to be able to fix it. You're going to be able to know that the software on your machine is the same stuff running on my machine when we have an argument over the best way to fix it or the best way to fix that bug or the way to enhance it with something. So that's the only way you can actually reach the scale you need, is to have that kind of reliability. The one other observation I'd offer you is Linus's law is actually about reviewing. All bugs are shallow if given enough eyes. That wasn't talking about debugging because of some bug that was found. If that was true, we would not have had all the problems with things like SSL and the rest of it over the last few years. No, that was the failure in community there was the community was too small, the review culture wasn't there. Linus's law applies. All bugs are shallow. You discover them before they become bugs in the executable thing that's distributed. That's the joy of it. There's a number of papers out there that have proven time and again you'll always find more bugs in review than you do in test. And that's kind of a startling thing, but you just do. And it doesn't matter. They've even, the one experiment, they even varied it with things like, was this formal, 6 people in a room together when they all had roles, or it was a desk check. No, even with a desk check by a coworker, you will still find more bugs in review than you ever do. And that's the strength of some of these communities, especially when you see one of the things that OpenStack gets right. And for anybody that's ever heard me rant against OpenStack, you'll know that there's not many things they get right. But one of the things they get right is they built a culture of review into the front end of it. And so that's huge because you're finding some of these problems early. So lastly, how do you actually go hunting for contributors? So this is that space where, again, you want to publish your coding guidelines. You want to tell people what to contribute. And if you're looking for people to help with the docs, all of these things apply. You need to be able to get to a place where you have a known set of docs. Any person that wants to participate can get to that known state. But you're making it easy for folks to get there. When I talk about kind of a second stage automation, I'm talking about that kind of thing of when you see some of the very modern projects right now go into this whole continuous integration, continuous deployment tool chain. So it's no longer kind of that first stage of automation of here's the make file. We're now into a second stage of automation where we're making it trivial for you to test your software in a known big environment rather than just doing it in your own small environment. That is, just a side story, that is one of the classic things I heard at the OpenStack Summit in Tokyo. Was some people are starting to question maybe the idea of allowing a whole lot of developers to test their clouds on DevStack on their own machine isn't the best way to test for something that's supposed to be managing large multi-machine clouds. You know, it's that kind of thing of how do you do this thing well? Again, there's some community aspects to those kinds of things. When we start looking at these things, you get into event management, you get into governance discussions. Because at this point, you're probably getting to the point where you want to start laying some of the foundations of this early. Now, at no point am I suggesting that you need to get all this stuff done on day one, but you do kind of need to walk through it in order, because that's how you're going to build these pipelines of people. Because really what you want to get to is you want to start with your project, and ultimately, you know, you want to advance from committers into contributors into a community of folks around it, and you want to ultimately build an ecosystem. Now, there are projects that don't. There are projects that are very happy to be small. But a lot of people really do want to foster that growth of their community. And that ecosystem is a rich ecosystem. You know, there's products based on this project. There's services around it. There's books. There's training. There's consultants. It's a big thing. There's certification projects. So that brings up a problem. Because if we're going to get to an ecosystem with projects and services, products rather, and services and all that stuff, what happens is you now have corporate contributors, and you need to figure out what to do with them, because these are different animals. And there's a fundamental thing that companies need that most projects in their infancy don't have. And that's where you get into, there's a whole pile of things that you need to do around IP management, because that's the one thing they care about. So again, the license, your first license was a social contract. That's how you, and if there was any other core committers when you started, that was the agreement you had for the governance you wanted to put into, but it was more of a gentleman's agreement. This was your early community and how you wanted to see it grow, the fundamental things you believed in, the social contract in an early community. Now we're talking about a license from the perspective, and I'm not suggesting you change your license, I'm not suggesting you change the values that you consider important. Just understand that corporations have opinions about licenses. Now again, if you stick with that small core group, you've got lots of flexibility, and half of them were written by corporate lawyers and half of them were written by academic lawyers, so you're mostly protected in that space already. They want to know about IP tracking, they want to know about provenance, they want to understand what your dependency graph looks like. So there's a pile of stuff there that if you've been doing things well, you've already probably put it in place. But just understand that this is a different set of practices for a different reason, because companies care about this other thing. Now there's a benefit here. There's an enormous benefit. If you put these practices in place, you can see an order of magnitude growth, because now you have dedicated resource, dedicated investment from corporate people that want to use this software in their products and services. And you're not selling out. I have not in any way suggested that you want to manage differently, change your committer structure, nothing like that. But it's an interesting place. The way a lot of people talk about this is from the perspective of foundations. I was technical director at the Outer Curve Foundation for 3 years, up to a couple of years ago. It was an interesting foundation, because this was the foundation that Microsoft was the primary founding sponsor for. It was a proper 501c6, so a trade organization. There was some awkward problems with it, because they kind of saw it as, well, we're Microsoft and we're going to tell you how to do open source. And you can imagine the community reaction to that. And I was certainly I walked into it with eyes wide open, but there was always that kind of, right, you're going to tell us how to do open source, this will be great. But there was a really interesting thing that coincided with that. A guy named Henrik Ingo. He's in Finland. He worked for MySQL. He currently works for MongoDB. I think he ran MariaDB for a while as the CEO when Monty was trying to build a corporation around it. He did a study, and it was a really interesting study. And what he demonstrated, and he pulled all the numbers, and he's a good engineer, so he listed where all of his data came from, all the assumptions he made, and he was careful not to suggest this was causative. But the number crunch he did demonstrated that the 9 largest, most vibrant open source communities are all hubbed in foundations. The 10th is an order of magnitude smaller. So while he's not claiming causality here, he's carefully suggesting that there's clearly something going on here. There is a correlation. And that becomes a really interesting thing. And so my executive director and I were stuck in there, and we were kind of, what is the theory of foundations? And the one thing that every foundation has to get right in the open source space, and this goes all the way back to the Free Software Foundation, is this idea of neutrality, a level playing field for all of those corporate participants that care about, I don't want to be building your product kind of thing, or I don't want you controlling my product kind of thing. All those go away if you have a foundation wrapped around it properly. Properly is an important word. I have other rants that I can do about foundations. And that is where you need this idea of very bright lines between what is the project and what is that community and what are the products over there that come out of these projects that have customers, because those are different things. And so here is a large collection of practices. You do need to think your way through this if you want to build a large, successful community. Like I said, these are not everything that has to be done on day one. I do not presume that anybody could do that. I mean, that's one of those things where you have so much architecture in the way, you never get to actually doing anything interesting in the project. But there is this set of patterns, and they really do fall around these idea of driving, encouraging users, encouraging developers, encourage your contributors, and then what do you have to do that next step up when corporate players show up? Because if you're doing the first things well, corporations will show up. There'll be developers that might have been part of your community who work for companies that go, we could do this in a product, or we could build this into our product, or we can contribute this, we can build a service around this for our customers. And so having that as that additional pattern, how do you think about those things? Because ultimately, you want to take this graph, and just like I was trying to do with the arrow, I keep trying different visuals. I'm looking for input. You want it to grow into this space. You want this to be a rich ecosystem where there's lots of stuff happening in that ecosystem, and lots of people want to participate for their own selfish reasons and their own needs. And you can support all of those things from that core project community. Going back to this diagram, so this is an interesting diagram because the really terrible thing is once you get corporate contributors, and once you have products based on your community, once there's services out there, once there's books and training and everything else, you end up with customers. But here again is this problem. They're not your customers. You're the community. You care about the project. That's what you started, and you might have a vibrant, you're Linus Torvalds, and Linux has taken over the world. But Linus is still Linus, and he still runs a community. That's the really interesting thing. He never gave up the trademark. He never gave up the source copyright, and he still runs that community in the way that he defines as best for the community overall. And then you step outside of that, and you look at this massive ecosystem of other things around it. And so what you really want to be careful of is getting sucked into any discussion about customers. Because in the same way that projects are not products, your community are not customers. And you got to be really careful. And again, I'm a big believer in bright lines, because when you talk about these things, we can have a discussion around community building. And there are excellent resources out there. There really are. Like I said, we've known how to build communities since you had a campfire and I wanted to sit beside it. Absolutely. And the thing is, in the product space, there are excellent, you can go get an MBA. There are excellent resources in how to build and drive products, market them, all the product management work that goes with it. But these things, there's a really bright line between the way those things work. And there's a bright line between the engineering work that has to happen. There's a bright line between how you have a conversation with your community versus how a company might have a conversation with a customer. If you're building, so I've been talking as if you were an independent community project that is growing up into this space. Everything I've said actually applies if you're a company trying to build that community, because you got to walk through all the same discussions. But the trap that so many companies fall into is they make it that customer and community conversation they think is one. Marketing folks think, well, our community, that's kind of like a big part of the funnel, and it's not. And the engineering teams, if they get this thing wrong, if they don't have good open source experience, they think, this is great, the community is going to be writing all kinds of things for us. And again, that's not actually the way it works. So you need to be able to get those conversations really crisp with very bright lines between them. And everybody inside the company needs to understand what those things look like. And that's the same thing that you have to do if you are an independent community. You need really bright lines for how you talk about these things. So I've got another talk that I'll do next year kind of thing. Part 2 of the talk is really how to think about those things with bright lines. I'm actually finished at this point, and I am happy to take questions, comments. Sir? So I'm just going to repeat this for the video. The statement is that I was being a little soft on patents and that you do need to think through them. I actually agree with you very much. What always fascinated me, the thing that is different about the Linux Foundation, because Linus wasn't giving up control of the actual IP, was unlike the Apache Software Foundation or the Free Software Foundation or the Eclipse Foundation. I guess it postdates though. When they set up the OSDL, when the big vendors got involved, they had to ring-fence the IP, and they ring-fenced it through exactly those kinds of things. So they immediately hired Linus and Andrew to make sure that they were individually protected in the same way that the Eclipse Foundation and the Apache Foundation protect their community contributors. They turned around and they started, there was some of the early work that the OSDL did was actually really pretty interesting stuff. It predates the Open Innovation Network and their patent pools. And those are, the OIN is a fabulous example of what can be done in this broad community of open source related companies and open source related projects. It's definitely something we have to consider. My personal view, I don't have an opinion on patents good or bad per se, but like you said, patents have to be managed. It's a reality in the world we live in. Go ahead. Absolutely, patent trolls do exist. The interesting thing, the way I've tried to explain it to people, because historically I did some consulting with small businesses that were doing open source related things, is patents are tickets to negotiations. They are, and until you're big enough to be making money, kind of thing. And that's, again, that's where the foundation, if you're growing into a space where multiple companies are involved, a foundation can actually help you think your way through some of those things. If you're a company doing these kinds of things, then you hopefully already have counsel on board that is advising you. And it's sometimes painful. I think a company that does interesting things in this space is Red Hat. I think they've found a strong balance for how they want to protect their community and protect the company at the same time. But thank you. Other comments, questions?
So you mentioned that corporate contributors are a different animal. I completely agree. And that kind of transition point from a small and medium-sized open source project is making that transition and getting corporate kind of contributors. Do you have any suggestions on how the community, especially the core developers, can onboard those corporate contributors in a way that doesn't freak out the rest of the community? So there tends to be...
Excellent question. How, as you go through the transition from a community that was kind of small and a little more organic into that space where corporate contributions are inbound, how do you manage that growth to not freak out your core community? So there's a couple of things there that we've all seen. So if you look at Linux, no, Linus really did run it the way Linus wanted to run it. And so corporate contributors showing up, we were lucky he was either young enough and arrogant enough or Finnish enough and strong-willed enough. I don't know. I don't care. he continued to evolve that community the way he saw fit. So knowing yourself, so to speak, having that strength and belief, and maybe having a GPL license on your software provides a very bright line for how corporations have to think about you. I think that was an enormous strength of that community. And so that was interesting. When you go back to Henrik's 9 projects, which dates up to 5 years ago, he and I started a different discussion just recently. So my CTO, Martin Fink, CTO of all of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, got up on stage at LinuxCon in Dublin, and his keynote was really about everybody has assumed for a long time that the Apache software license was the business-friendly license. But that we shouldn't not think about the GPL as the other business-friendly license. There's lots of things to do with that. And that's where I think the GPL provides a very bright line and simplifies that discussion as companies come to play, because they're going to be very careful. But the other thing, so when you go back to Henrik's 9 projects, 6 of them are GPL'd, 2 of them are weak copy left. There's only 1 of them that's Apache licensed, and it happens to be the Apache group. So I had the discussion with the president of the Apache Foundation, because it was like, what's different there? Why? And the best conclusion we had, that goes back to your question about how do you scale that community and not freak out the original community, Apache has the incubator. And the incubation process is 12 to 24 months that you have to come through the incubation process to be declared a full Apache project. Now, while it's always been stated from the outside as this is, we're teaching you how to be good community developers working together in the Apache way. So it's always about the Apache way. It's always about the software engineering. The reality of it, one of the net benefits of it as well, is it drives all commercial discussion out of the room. It builds that very bright line around what is the project and how does that community interact around what good things, and yeah, what you do in your project or what you do in your products and your services is your business. And so it's building that bright line, and I think it's, so you can see a number of ways of doing it, but you know, do it with the GPL, do it with a strong copy left. I won't just declare the GPL. Do it with a strong copy left, or provide a process that drives that conversation out of the room, which requires either a process like the Apache way, the Eclipse way, as in, you know, they do it the same, similar kind of thing in the Eclipse Foundation, or Linus was simply strong enough as that benevolent dictator to actually lay down the law as to how this would happen. And because he never gave up the IP, at the end of the day, you know, it was his way or the highway. But good question, because those are the kinds of things we see regularly. Other questions? What about forks? That's a great question as well. So what about forks? So as a company who did not want to live on a fork in the late 90s, I worked very hard, even though we were pulling software out of the open source community, to ensure that all of our engineering contribution went back upstream. So again, I was very crisp in what was my product, how did I package it, how do I license it, what do I do for my customers, but I don't want to eat the engineering cost of a fork as a company, because that'll only get more and more and more expensive over time. So you want to contribute everything back upstream if it's not your project. So big believer in not living on a fork. Big believer in there is one code base for the project if you're a corporate player. The thing that destroyed the Symbian Foundation, utterly destroyed it, is when they flipped it from Symbian into the Symbian Foundation. The code was still being written by Nokia, they were first amongst equals, and they published into the community for the rest of the community of vendors to pull from. So the vendors left. It's that simple. So there needs to be that one true place, no forks. There should not have been the Nokia Symbian release plus everybody else's. And then in the reverse, we've seen the occasional catastrophic fork. GCC versus EGCS. back in the late 90s. That was a huge war over the future of the GCC compiler suite. And that lasted, God, I think better part of 14 to 16 months. I mean, it wasn't over quickly, that argument. There was two parallel growing trees of code, and they finally understood themselves the engineering economics as open source projects was ultimately to knit it back together. So there was one true GCC. You can look at things like Jenkins versus Hudson? Hudson, thank you. That again, to me, that's the kind of failure you saw with Symbian. That's Oracle just upsetting the planet and not caring. Now in that case, they could. In the Symbian case, it killed them. But nobody talks about Hudson anymore. And that was a case where I think it was a really interesting case that as strong as the Apache way is, there are still failures along the way. Statistically, not that many. You know, when you look at the growing number of projects that continue to graduate the incubator, you know, the entire big data space based around Hadoop, all the excellent work that continues to come out of Apache, it's great. But no, forks are not good. So that was the long answer. Forks are not good is the short answer. And it doesn't matter whether you're a corporation or a community. You do not want to have forks happening. All of it. So in terms of the different approaches, just to repeat the question, the different approaches to dealing with patents in the community, different communities handle it in different ways. Patents tend to be places where corporations care deeply. Microsoft screams about patents all the time. And what you guys have to remember is you might be the generation that remembers Microsoft wielding patents against Linux. I have more gray hair. I remember when IBM screwed over Microsoft in their initial patent discussion, so Microsoft suddenly became very adamant about patents that were important. I've seen a brilliant journalist article on the first time IBM approached Sun as well, and back in the late 80s, and kind of kicked Sun around for a while until Sun signed the cross-license deal. So patents tend to be a big company thing. I like the approach that OIN has of defensive patent pools. I like the approach that Red Hat finally, as Red Hat grew, I mean, it's now a $2 billion company by revenue and a $10 billion by valuation. You know, they have had to think through a patent strategy as a company that does not upset their community. And there's there's lots of hardcore anti-patent, anti-IP folks. You know, you almost have the IP anarchists. There's always one or two in a room that are way out on the fringe. And that community, the Linux community, still functions because Red Hat has found that balancing line. It's a rich enough community to support all those points of view. So I don't think there's ever one right way, because if you were balancing your own community, if you're growing it well, you're going to have everybody from extreme anti-patent folks all the way through to, if you're very successful and you have corporate players, people that want to understand your patents. The really interesting thing that I have not spoken to enough lawyers to understand why more companies aren't playing this game. WebM, when Google did WebM, they did it under the Berkeley license, because the Berkeley license is a well-understood open source license that has zero discussion and zero ambiguity about patents. And then, for that project, they said, by the way, we have a different license for all the other IP around it. And they used that as the way to clarify their state around patents with respect to this space. And I thought that was a really interesting way to handle it as a corporation, because they weren't, it left them a certain amount of freedom of play, but it also allowed them to be very clear with their community of exactly what they thought of patents with respect to this software market. So I wish there was a clean right answer. For a long time there's something called a provisional patent, which is very cheap. You don't have to write all the claims. It's like $130 or $150 to file. I always thought that would be great. You file a whole lot of cheap provisionals. They last for 12 months, and then you lapse them. So you're just salting the fields around you. Because you've now put a stake in the ground that said, this is no longer an invention. I have talked about it in this. And you didn't have to go through all the legal expense of getting, really well crafted. Well, it turns out the lawyers have caught on to this idea, and the way they want to do provisionals now is they still want to charge you $2,000 or $3,000 for the patent search, and they still want to. If they're not going to write full claims for you, they at least want to start to draft them in a little bit for you, because obviously you're going to want to turn that provisional into a real patent application. So it's again, I am not a lawyer. You do not want patent advice from me, but I've seen some interesting plays from different communities trying to tackle things, and trying to be honest with their community. I just want to expressly say I have no opinion on anything going on in the Ubuntu canonical world right now. Other questions? At the back.
My apologies if you covered this, but what do you think about contributor agreements?
What do I think about contributor agreements? I'm going to do the two-step, you know that, because I've two-stepped along here with everything to do with legal all along.
From the ecosystem of a project,
Yeah.
build your project up?
The time when they become important is, again, that crossover line when suddenly corporations want to understand provenance. And I think there's an argument to be made that if you want to keep the bar very low and you want some confidence that you could grow into that space, is just do the DCO for now. If you're starting small and you're using the developer certificate of origination, you at least you can finger point back to a list of people in the contribution stream that you've been committing into the core code base for however long that's been. As a demonstration that, look, we do kind of know who this came from. And we do have kind of at least a first pass statement that this is interesting. And that kind of thing can work because the worst case that we ever saw in something that became big was what happened with Apache. The early days of Apache, nobody knew who was committing what into where kind of thing. It wasn't complete Wild West. There was good engineers doing good things, but nobody was tracking it. And again, you got to remember, it was only 1980 that we started applying copyright to software. So it became a space where, when they formed the Apache Software Foundation, because again, there was big companies that had big lawyers that were concerned and they wanted to use it in products. That's why the play they did was more of it's an aggregate of software. And so we don't really worry about where it came from in the early days. So you can deal with the ambiguity, but I think being crisp up front, just doing a DCO on the way by, keeps it a very low barrier to entry. If you go look up Developer Certificate of Origin, I believe is what it stands for. Just Google it. It'll take you right to the page. That's what they use in the Linux world. Now, I will push back. I used to get into a debate with Richard Fontana, who was legal counsel at Red Hat, and he used to say, no, you don't need contributor license agreements because, gosh, the DCO works great on Linux. Nobody's challenging us. Okay, Linux is a snowflake. Linux is special. There is so much big money floating around Linux that we all saw what happened when somebody tried to challenge that space once before. At the end of the day, very large companies with very deep pockets and very large benches of lawyers are just going to ride that storm out for the rest of us. So Linux gets a bit of a buy. But I think it is a responsible way to think about it if you were a small project and you were just moving along. You will always be able to go back to say, that developer with that name was responsible for that contribution. See, it's right here in my versioning system, and so I can even point to specific versions if we ever had to rip it out for, God forbid, whatever reason. You know exactly when it hit the code base, and you can go back. It's a useful way to track it. I've heard lots of folks have opinions that it slows things down. I think that depends on how awkward you make it. To me, if you're staying small and moving fast, I'd go with a DCO. there a way to slow down corporate involvement? Wow, that's a great question. And they might even be deliberate in that steamrolling, not mentioning OpenStack by name. Fred Brooks and the idea that, adding more people to the discussion, building a bigger team slows things down because there's more lines of communication. So I saw Brooks' law applied as a weapon in the standards wars back in the 90s around Unix. You see, if you add lines of communication, it slows things down. And there were certain big vendors that really did not want certain things in the Unix spec space happening too quickly. So they just suggest yet another liaison point to this other group over there. And all of a sudden you keep adding these things. They almost ground us to a halt. So that was how big corporations were definitely slowing down a small group of engineers trying to build some interesting standards. There is that problem with too many cooks in the kitchen, slowing things down. So I think a way, I'm making this up as I go, I've never been asked that. It is a great question. I would think about how you maintain your governance before you get into that space. If you've got to a point where you actually have a few committers, then you should have a way in terms of encouraging other contributors that there should be some statement somewhere on how do you become a committer? How do you get right privilege on things? And that way you can start to think about ways early that you might have to deal with the problem of a whole lot of contributions flowing in, or people demanding that, well, if we're giving you all these contributions, why aren't you patching them faster, or. If you can be really crisp in how you become a committer, then that gives you, if you have that conversation before you need to have it, you're in a place that you can feel confident either telling them why they don't get a committer just because they've sent all this code, or while maybe as a collection of committers you think they do deserve because you've been accepting all of those contributions, they've been clean and strong, and this is the person identified that was sending them all in. So that's the way I try and think about that problem. What have I seen in the open source hardware space? I am interested in that space, and I've seen nothing because I haven't gone and looked yet. So I'm afraid I am fascinated. I actually just started conversations here this week to start to go learn a little more about that. So to me, it's a really interesting space. I know that the kinds of places that I suspect there's going to be interesting questions is historically all the body of law that came out in there, it was very patent heavy because we're talking about things that were, they were atoms in the real world, not bits in the software world. And if you look at even some of the history of companies like IBM, Intel, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, my employer, we're hardware companies. We have a very different way of thinking about hardware patents versus software patents. One of the fun things, if you go back all the way through the history of the Eclipse license, when it used to be the common public license, when it used to be the IBM public license, there is a small phrase buried in there that has never changed, even though it was the IBM license and it was a common public license as administered by IBM and is now the Eclipse license as administered by the Eclipse Foundation. But that phrase in the IP section on patents said, this does not apply to hardware patents. They were very clear there. And it's one of those things where I think that's going to be an area that is hugely interesting and different from what we've wrestled with in software. And it's also the manufacturing costs, even though things are plummeting with some of the new technologies we have in terms of 3D printing and just the ability to build physical things and prototype physical things for normal people like us without spinning up entire supply chains. There's still going to be a lot of legal opinion and legal conservative opinion left over from the days where it costs real money to build a fab kind of thing. So that it's going to be interesting in that space, but that's a guess. That is, I have seen nothing, I've looked at nothing. If there's no other questions, I think we've hit time. Thank you very much, folks.